Hi, and welcome back to Philosophy with Phil, with me, Phil Cohen. This is the second Shavuos video. The first one talked about the names of Shavuos. We're going to go a little bit more in depth in this video. But just to summarise, we talked about Chag HaKotzir, that Shavuos is the time of transition from God's ownership of the Torah or the crops over to our ownership, our rishus. Okay, that's the important thing. And then there's a direct relationship between us and God on Shavuos that we don't get at any other time as much in this way. So, I'm going to look at a piece of Gemara and a Mishnah and raise a question on each of those and show how we can tie it all into Shavuos. And I want to show how they relate to something that you might have thought is something completely unrelated, and that is what we call in Hebrew Techias HaMesim, or revival or resuscitation of the dead. Bear with me, it'll all become clear. So, first we're going to look at the Gemara. The Gemara in Shabbos is on page 30, Lamed, on the first side of the page at the bottom. And King David, it describes a dialogue between King David and God, where King David asks God, when will I die? And there's a whole sort of dialogue between the two, there's negotiations that go on. Cut long story short, God says, well, I can't tell you the exact date, but it will be a Shabbos. Okay. To cut to the chase, actually the Gemara in Chagiga, that's another tractate of Gemara, on page 12, Yud Beis, on the first side of the page, it tells us that King David Yortzeit actually died on Shavuos, so that's the connection with Shavuos. So every Shabbos, to prevent this death, King David learns Torah all day long. And we learn elsewhere that learning Torah is a way of mitigating against the angel of death. The angel of death can't take someone once they're learning Torah. And so that way he pushes off his death. The day arrives for the angel of death to take David, and as I say, he comes down and he sees David learning Torah. He can't take him whilst he's learning Torah, so the angel of death decides to create a distraction. And during that distraction, David will pause his learning, and then he can take him. So what does the angel of death do? Well, most people would do something fairly dramatic, like pull a chair from under his feet, or I don't know, slap him about the face, or do something to pause his learning, and then take him then. But what the angel of death does is something quite curious. He goes out into the garden of the palace, the royal gardens, and rattles a tree. Not the most obvious of choices, but it works. And sure enough, David is disturbed by that. He pauses in his learning, goes out to see what's going on. Bang, the angel of death gets him. Okay, it worked, but why did it work? And what was the angel doing? What was the angel of death doing, rattling a tree? Okay, so that's question number one. Question number two is on a Mishnah, the second Mishnah of the tractate of Rosh Hashanah that deals with the festivals and the new moon. And it's the second Mishnah of the first chapter. And it goes something like this. At four junctures, at four interchanges, at four changes, the world is judged. But Pesach on Pesach for the grain. But Teres al Parasa'ilon, on Shavuos, Teres we've said previously is another name for Shavuos. But Teres al Parasa'ilon on Shavuos for fruit of the tree. But Rosh Hashanah, I'll think about Rosh Hashanah, and then at the end it says B'chag, and that's talking about Sukkos, Nidonim al Alamayim, we're judged for water. But I want to focus on Shavuos. But Teres al Parasa'ilon, on Shavuos, on fruit of the tree. Now I'll grant you, okay, it says Pesach al Hatavur, on Pesach on the grain, but on Teres it says al Parasa'ilon, fruit of the tree. What tree is it referring to? Now it's easy to say this is talking about Bikurim, fruits of the tree that were brought on Shavuos typically, but they were brought right the way through to Hanukkah, as I said. So not necessarily that. Why is it in the singular? Paras ha'ilon, fruit of the tree. It just seems a bit strange. So those are the two questions. Why did the angel of death rattle a tree? And what is the fruits of the tree in the Mishnah? So, the Mahashar, which is a commentary on the Gemara, and this Gemara is on the Mishnah that we've just given. This is in Rosh Hashanah. It's on page 16, Tesayin, on the first side of the page. And he talks about three dimensions or boundaries that define an object. An object exists in time, it exists in space, and it exists in the spiritual dimension, which he calls nefesh. Let me explain. Something exists in time, and it doesn't exist before or after that time. Okay, and we define it by its boundary. So this dimension we define is called shana. Why? Because something exists. Shana means year, by the way. Because something exists through that year, and then we talk about the next year. So, for example, if I talk about last Hanukkah, or I talk about last Pesach, or whatever it was, we talk about it within the frame of a year. And by the time the year comes round again, it's a new cycle. So it's called time. It's called shana. The next dimension is space. Everything occupies a space. And space is called olam, universe. Why? Because something exists within a space, but beyond that space is the rest of the universe. And that space is the juncture between it and the rest of the universe. Finally, everything has a spiritual dimension that sustains it. Whether it's the soul, the neshama, whatever it is, it has a spiritual dimension. And that is represented by bechira, free will. Free will is the juncture between something being pulled or someone being pulled towards their animal baser, selfish, egoistic drives, and their spiritual, loftier, higher drives that are going to connect them closer to their maker, to God. Those three dimensions are reflected in the three festivals. According to the Maharshal, he links Pesach with time. So much about Pesach is about time. If you look on the calendar, you'll see Pesach instantly. It's the one with all the times. When you can start and stop eating comets, and when you've got to eat, and you've got to eat in this particular time, and the time, blah, 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 blah. Sukkot is about space. Sukkot is a festival where we dwell in a construction with a fixed dimension of space. And Shavuos, it says, is about Bechira, it's about our free will, it's about our opportunity to choose. If you look at each of those festivals, by the way, you'll see, firstly, the first Mishnah in Pesachim, the first Mishnah in Sukkot talks about time and space, and secondly, you'll see that there are exclusions of the other dimensions. So, for example, Matzah, on Pesach, Pesach is about time, but Matzah is not about space, it only exists in two dimensions. Sukkot is about space and not time. We can spend as much time as we like in the sukkah, and Shavuos is about neither. We don't know where the Torah was given. We don't know when it was given. The date of Shavuos is very vague in the Torah, and the Gemara discusses that. So Bechira is our free will, and just to recap on free will, I did do another video on this. Bechira is our objectivity and the choice, the objectivity, and it's a choice between two appealing options, equally appealing options. Okay, that can pull us either further away or closer to our God, to our spiritual source. The Omer period, the period between Pesach and Shavuos, is a time when we cultivate good character traits, our objectivity, as Rav Dessler calls it, and refining our free will so that we are less driven by our animal instincts and we're able to balance those with spiritual goals. But Rabbi Tanura, who's a commentator on the Mishnah, says something interesting on this Mishnah. He says that the fruit of the tree is talking about the fruits of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And he's quoting, by the way, a Tosfos in Bava Basra to give this point. Our fruit, the tree of good knowledge of good and evil is the tree that was in the Garden of Eden. And the Bartanura links Shavuos to that decision that Adam and Eve took in the Garden of Eden to take on Bechira, to take on free will, and have a counterbalance to their existence up until now, which was purely spiritual. What they wanted by eating of the fruits of the tree of knowledge of good and evil was to be influenced equally by their animal instincts, their selfish instincts, and their spiritual instincts. Why? Because they found that life was too boring, one of the explanations given. By basking in the glory of God, they had no free will, because they had no other choice. Who would want to do anything else? But by eating of the tree, they were exposed to the flip side, the choice that the snake wanted to give them, and they were then given their bechira, given their free will. And that's what is meant by Eitz Hadas, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. It's interesting to note that the Gemara tells us, the Talmud tells us, when it talks about the Matan Torah, the giving of the Torah, in Tractate Shabbos again, page 88. onwards, and that the children of Israel achieved the status of Adam and Eve before they sinned at the tree. In other words, they used the Omer period to refine their character traits, what we call in Hebrew midas, their measures, their behaviour, in such a way that they were able to absorb the Torah. Okay. Equally, when the angels argue with Moses as to why they should be given the Torah and not him, as I say, back in the Gemara again, Moses' rebuttal to that is, well, you don't have Bechira, you don't have an evil inclination. There's no point, you can't keep Torah if you don't have that evil inclination. You don't have that drive, then the Torah has no value to you, because it doesn't tell you how to control and measure that counter influence. So on Shavuos, we are judged on our use of our free will, on our Bechira, on how we've used our free will to inform the decisions that we've made in our day-to-day lives, how we've used our Torah knowledge, how we've used our development of our midas, and how we've used it to develop our good character traits in our absorption of Torah and absorption into our decisions of day-to-day life. So it's almost like we're thinking about the way we're thinking on Shavuos. It's interesting to note that many great thinkers produced their greatest works, not when they were learning, but when they were just left alone to think. There's a beautiful video on TED Talks, by the way. I like TED Talks a lot, given by a chap called Jacob Barnett, who's autistic, and he talks about this, how autistic children need time to think. And if we think about, I don't know, Shimon Bar Yochai, who wrote the Zohar whilst he was trapped in a cave. The Tanya was written in prison. But even in the secular world, Newton wrote most of his great works whilst he was in hiding in Cambridge when he was quarantined because of the plague. Einstein wrote his works on relativity when he was a patent clerk, and when he wasn't learning, he wasn't studying, he was just thinking. So, how does this all tie in with King David, and what was the tree and everything? So, King David led his life trying to get back to that stage of bliss. He wanted to reduce his free will so that he was only serving God. He wanted to get back to that pre-sleep stage, that pre-sin stage in the Garden of Eden. And he did it by doing everything he could to avoid death. Let me explain. Sleep makes us unconscious to a while, and that's a semblance of death. Death is a reminder of our mortality, our fallibility, and our inability to conquer our evil inclination, which is as manifest in the angel of death. It tells us those are the same things. So David would avoid sleep as much as he could. The Gemara in Sukkah tells us this. In Sukkah tells us 26, page 26b, tells us about how David would sleep like a horse. He would rarely sleep, or sleep very lightly. We, in turn, avoid sleep on Shavuos. Actually, we do it on Shana Rabbah as well. Those are 2 days closely associated with death. Shavuos being the Yotzeit, the day of death of King David, and Shana Rabbah, the 7th day of Sukkot, a day that is closely connected with King David. He's one of the 7 of Pizin that we invite in on Shavuos, on Sukkot. So we too want to distance ourselves from this death, from this fallibility, from this bechira, this free will. And what the angel of death was doing by rattling the tree in the garden was saying, no, you're a human being at the end of the day, and I will take you as a human being. You can't avoid it. Revival of the dead, though, is the flip of that, is that transition. Like I said, Shavuos is Chag HaKotzir, is the time of our harvest, of that transition, that flip from God's rishus to ours. The Bnei Yisrael, the children of Israel, when they were at Har Sinai, the Gemara tells us that God used dew, something that we're very much connected with Pesach and the instigation of our relationship with God, to revive the children of Israel. When they were exposed to him at Mount Sinai, mass revelation, they died. Their souls left their bodies, and like a magnet, they were drawn to the higher source. So God had to put them back in and use dew to do that. This revival he did on Shavuos, because Shavuos is very much a time for that transition, that switch. And if God was going to be able to do that, he knew that the propitious time for doing that would be Shavuos. And that's the connection with revival of the dead, avoidance of death,